I would admit there's a problem today where you've got lobbying and all the rest of it, and you've got politicians that are bought and paid for it, and I don't deny that fact, but that's because you're living in the absence of a free market economy.
In reality, the power of politicians, and therefore the state, is held by those who have the money to keep the people they want in power. Our system of politics not only allows this to happen, it incentivizes it.
But the main problem is down to the people like yourself who are calling out for state this and state that and state this, that and the next thing. State education, state healthcare. Well, how are you going to get that? Through income taxation. That's the very reason why it's a self-serving government, because you've created a dependent class. You basically put the government as the central authority over you. Expecting a government to then serve you after that is just delusional.
The lack of accountability for one's actions in politics also incentivizes elected officials to be all talk and no action.
So well, they're making promises to you, but you've got economic reality to think about. Why else do you think Biden never gave you what he promised? $15 minimum wage. It's economic reality, because money pays for everything. It's no simple as a politician can just, promise this and voila, there it is. No less he wants to create devastation. But your socialist days, when there's mass unemployment, you brush it under the carpet and pretend it didn't even exist and say, oh, look at the $15 minimum wage working.
There are no consequences to a politician's lies.
Are you honestly trying to tell me that if a politician lies to you, that there's no consequences? So if that was the case, then how the hell did the Labour Party lose much of its support? That is consequences.
As a society, we finance, support, and incentivize a system that cares nothing at all for our interests while lining the pockets of its most glamorous members and key executives with obscene wealth.
So here we have your concession. You're filling their pockets with obscene wealth, which came from tax money. So in order to fix the problem, you want to fix the problem with more government. People didn't even consent to the income tax anyway, but they're taxing people. Now, this is where you think it's just a case of, oh well, we'll bring in more government regulations. More regulations to regulate the regulators. It's like, and then who's going to regulate the regulators of the regulators?
The office of President, Chancellor, or Prime Minister, if it needs to be held at all, should be occupied by those among us who are the most altruistic.
Hi everybody, I'm an altruistic lefty, and I care about people so much. I'm also a moral lefty. I'm so moral that I will force you into a collective group, and I'll force you to pay for others because that's apparently moral. I'm so altruistic that I'll impose a $15 minimum wage, and if you can't afford it, then of course you shouldn't be running business because I'm altruistic. When I raise the $15 minimum wage, and so many of you end up unemployed, who cares about them because I'm altruistic. The champions of the poor, the champions of everything that is so kind, considerate and compassionate, stick a gun to your head and force you to do whatever it is, such of course paying the income tax they pay for their healthcare because they demand that they have a right to healthcare. The forced altruism is moral. Oh, I'm so not selfish. Whenever it comes to the unemployment soaring out of control through the consequences of their silly actions, well, who cares about them, eh? Just look at the NHS and the thousands of people who lose their lives every single year because of their forced altruism.
Those who have shown a willingness to devote their lives to making everyone's lives better, not to be filled with the worst humanity has to offer.
So what the hell do you call the NHS neglecting thousands of cancer patients and heart disease patients every single year, where they're left to die because of the long waiting lines and the surplus waste problems and the shortage problems of medical doctors and the hospital beds and all sorts? Do you call that altruism?
Power-hungry politicians with no morals are the enemy.
And there you have it, folk. The concession to say it's not government itself that's the problem. It's not the fact that we're dependent upon the state that's the problem. It just happens to be we just don't have the right politicians.
New policies holding politicians to account for their words and actions, as well as removing the incentive of personal gain, could be the answer to many of the crises we see today.
So government created a problem, so in order to solve the problem, we need more government.
That being said, the end goal, one that is shared by a growing number of Americans both on the left and the right, is the withering away of the state entirely.
They're the ones that are the cause of the problem, because they end up giving more and more power to the state. Of course they do. They want to get into the private sector. Your only way to do that is through nationalisation via the government. That gives the government more and more power. It keeps growing in size. It doesn't just wither away. What are we expecting? As soon as the government nationalises everything, it'll just disappear.
But in the meantime, there are ways to improve the system under which we all operate. There are options for creating a state that represents the interest of the people.
By collectivism, that places the state as the main element of the economy. And if you're not going to run the private sector, you're going to have to run the printing press. So that's the only way you can pay wages. And I've got a concession for yourself for previous videos. He basically says how you could improve things by paying wages, so you admit you need to pay wages. So if you want to pay wages, you're going to need a private sector. But all you're doing is creating the exact same problem. You're basically creating dependency upon the state. The problem with the state itself is that you depend upon it.
The first step is to align political action and policies with societal interest.
Their interests mean nothing in the face of economic reality. But let's just take, for argument's sake, again, the $15 minimum wage. Do you think if most people argue for price caps on, for example, gas and electricity, you think because that's in their interest that we should have that? Because I'll tell you this, you know what that would 100% result in? Power shortage problems. According to you, that's the right way forward. We should just listen to people who don't even understand anything about economics and ignore economic reality. Politicians can't ignore economic reality, so what makes you think you can?
Then, dismantle special interest groups, destroy the power of lobbies, and subject the system to maximum transparency.
And it's just like how, those people who believe in taxing the rich, as if they just stick around to pay for it all. You just want to try and fix the problem with more government, when government is the cause of the problem.
Finally, we would need to remove the financial incentive of politics.
How are you going to finance the government then in order to pay for all those things? Because you're calling it for, mere nationalisation. That's essentially what you're calling it for. So we've established the fact you want a massive bloated public sector. The private sector's not going to be there to pay for it. You'd have to run the printing press, which is going to drive inflation through the roof. A massive big bloated public sector is going to cost an absolute bomb. If you want to limit the government to its income and stuff like that, then there's the serious problem that you've got.
We already know how to measure societal well-being, what metrics to focus on, and how to improve people's lives.
No, you don't. Because you're faced with the economic calculation problem and knowledge problem, because it's the government that's the one that controls the prices. And as soon as the government controls the prices, it distorts the information of profits and losses. I've said this umpteen times before. I've pointed out in videos on the economic calculation problem that refutes that nonsense.
It isn't rocket science. We can start with something simple, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A series of acknowledgements so fundamental, so basic, that no decent person would try to denigrate its validity.
What you're arguing for is basically positive rights. What that means is, in practice, that is, the state is the one that grants you your rights over the collective group. And of course, since the state grants you your rights, the state has the power to take those rights away from you at any given time. You're not truly free. You don't truly have rights if you're getting permission for it. The other thing is, who says you've got a right all my life? Because you have to subordinate the individual's rights and liberty in order to have your positive rights. So you need to infringe upon the rights of an individual. We have a right to healthcare. Well, you don't. You don't have a right to healthcare because people have to work for it. And you're trying to claim that people like yourself have got an entitlement to what they're earning. It's a good, it's a service in the market. That doesn't mean to say that healthcare shouldn't be affordable. Where's the validity in taking away my rights?
Another place to look for examples to follow is the World Happiness Report. In this report, you can find all the best performing countries in terms of their citizens' happiness.
Here we go again with this happiness index. Folk, I'll just leave you with this and you can watch this. Reason for why that is. A following quote by a fellow Brit, Michael Booth, sums up how deeply flawed the happiness index is. He says, unquote, those sky-high happiness surveys, it turns out, are mostly bunk. Asking people, are you happy, means different things in different cultures. In Japan, for instance, answering yes seems like boasting, Booth points out, whereas in Denmark it's considered shameful to be unhappy. Newspaper editor Anne Knudsen says in the book, moreover, there is a group of people that believes the Danes are lying when they say they are the happiest people on the planet. This group is known as Danes. Over the years I have asked many Danes about these happiness surveys. whether they really believe that they are the global happiness champions, and I have yet to meet a single one of them who seriously believes it's true. Booth writes, they tend to approach the subject of their much vaunted happiness like the victims of a practical joke waiting to discover who the perpetrator is. Again, much like Kevin D. Williamson touched upon the opinion surveys as mentioned in my video on the economic calculation problem, people often say things different to how they actually feel. You cannot determine how happy people are by asking people in surveys how they feel. People often give dishonest answers.
What all these countries have in common are governments implementing legislation that makes the average citizen's life better.
As I pointed out before, folk, Denmark is a country that is not as wonderful as try to claim it out to be. Little do they realise when they look at the actual official figures, it's nothing compared to that of the real figures. The real unemployment is sky high compared to that of the official figures. It's a country that's taxed them half to death. These countries have a severe lack of productivity in their domestic economies. So in other words, they're not sustainable in the long term, and you can't depend upon natural resources because they don't last forever. And are they as happy as they think they are? Well, why the hell did Denmark set it saying tax administration building and file? Is that how happy it is? And it's even laughable when they bring up about these universal healthcare systems, these free healthcare systems.
Let's talk a bit about healthcare. What would you tell an American who knew very little about the Swedish healthcare system?
Well, first of all, I would really look at the broader picture. Where does the healthcare technologies come from that the Swedish hospitals use? Where do the drugs and the medicines come from? Well, all of it is really invented, implemented in the American competitive healthcare system. So in effect, what we're doing is that we're free riding on the entrepreneurship that goes on, in the competition that goes on in the American healthcare system. So whatever you do, and whatever the consequences for Americans, I'm not the one to really have a strong opinion on that. Please, please, please don't introduce any sort of single payer or government-mandated healthcare system here, because in that case it would be disastrous for all the rest of us who parasite upon the invention that goes on here. You have to somehow ration healthcare. The demand is unlimited, the resources are limited. So either you have to ration it with prices and making sure that people pay for it themselves and think about what they want to have covered, or you ration it with waiting lines. I mean, if you have a condition in Sweden, it could be serious conditions. We have stories about that in the media all the time. People have a brain tumor and get the response that, yeah, just wait in line until we have the machinery and the doctors ready for you.
These states guarantee the people's right to medical treatment, rather than lining the pockets of the pharmaceutical and insurance companies that don't pay their taxes.
He just ignored the fact that with the main American healthcare market, it's sitting there with a third-party payer system that his socialism created, and that allowed the pharmaceutical companies to get away with forming a collusion to shaft the consumers. So his socialism is actually the cause of the problem. The government is the problem. The state is the problem.
Funding priorities in these happiest countries are also vastly different from US priorities. One of America's favorite things to spend money on is death. The US is the leading exporter of killing machines internationally.
But that's just clarifying the fact that government is the cause of the problem. That's not a problem in the market. That's just clarifying, that's actually vindicating the libertarian argument to say, well, here's why we should roll back in the state.
8 out of these 11 countries offer completely free education, including university, with the remaining 3 offering generous amounts of financial aid.
Again, I'm not going to go too much into it, but the whole thing on the free stuff, it's not free. It's paid for elsewhere in the economy by compensating elsewhere. So it's not just a case of taxation, it's actually more expensive. And again, even it comes down to the moral argument, it's all force, coercion, coercively forcing folk to pay for others.
Not only is their education free, but its quality is miles ahead of anything we could dream of here in the US.
When you look at the United States of America, you don't even have true private ownership, and you're sitting there with state education and all sorts, and it's been an abysmal failure.
The other is to strip politicians of financial incentives and impose total transparency on all the financial dealings that involve elected officials. The average American is bound by law to reveal all their financial information to the state. But in return, those who make up the state have no legal obligation to do the same.
Not only do you think that there's government theft and violence through taxation is somehow moral? You think it's somehow moral to take away people's privacy and start making it so-called transparent to see where they're spending their money? What business is it to you where people spend their money? It's none of your business. It's none of your business to begin. It's not your money anyhow. You're to thieve it. Now, that's the reason why everything about you socialists, you have not got a moral argument. Your entire case of what you stand for is immoral. You're morally bankrupt.
It is important that we guarantee a reasonable standard of living to our leaders, as we should for everyone.
The only way you can guarantee is by forcing others. Moral, but you have to force everything.
But it is ridiculous that we allow them to live like kings and incentivize the greedy to pursue political careers.
The reason why they're living like kings to begin with is because your altruistic, so-called moral worldview resulted in the government gaining more and more power and you became more dependent upon them. It leads to the exact same results. You're never going to get rid of that problem.
Placing all these politicians on the median American wage would significantly reduce their interest in the position, and might just help in giving the real altruists, those who actually care about making life better for the rest of us, a shot at a job they would perform admirably.
The true altruists. How can you claim such arrogance? And you even implied that we should lay down rent controls. You know what that leads to? The rich benefiting from it, and the poor end up homeless and all sorts. So-called real altruists, we're screwed. And we're screwed because people like you exist, because you don't even have a clue what you're talking about.